Welcome to the DevelopmentAid online webinar session. We are excited to have you join us. We strongly encourage active participation in our discussions, and all participants who stay until the end of the event will receive a certificate of attendance via email 24 hours after the webinar. To ensure that everyone can participate, all cameras and microphones are automatically muted. You can submit your questions or comments via the questions section on the screen, or participate in the polls during the event to let us know your opinion. We look forward to an engaging and insightful discussion. Enjoy.
Well, hello everyone. On behalf of DevelopmentAid, I welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Jon and I'll be moderating this event. Please let me know if you have any issues hearing or seeing us well. As usual, we have several polls planned for our event, so don't hesitate to participate because your opinion matters to us. Before we move to the introductions, I would like to start our first quick poll to get a better understanding from which part of the world you're joining us from. So the first poll should be visible on your screen now. Okay, so in the world of international development evaluation, ethical challenges are seldom straightforward. So faced with time constraints, political sensitivities, data privacy issues, resource limitations, and unequal power relationships, M&E professionals often encounter difficult decisions with no obvious right answers. So the challenge isn't just knowing what's right, it's deciding what to do when competing ethical principles pull in different directions. So if such ethical dilemmas are left unaddressed, they can compromise participant safety, ruin reputations, and derail organizational funding. So organized in collaboration with Includovate, a global multidisciplinary social enterprise registered in Australia and dedicated to empowering women and girls, marginalized communities, and other excluded groups. This exclusive event features 3 leading experts who will discuss how to identify common ethical dilemmas and apply practical strategies to navigate them in real-world scenarios. So, as I was covering our introductions, we had the first poll running, and if you haven't selected your option yet, please do so. I take note that about 70% of those who joined already voted. So we can shortly close the first poll and display the results. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, the vast majority of our attendees today join us from Africa. We have another 26% joining us from Europe, about 10% joining us from Asia, Middle East, and 6% joining us from Americas. So thank you so much, as usual, for joining us from the part of the world you're living in. We really appreciate you dedicated time to join us today. So while I will shortly move to the to introduction the speakers for today's event, we will have our second poll running to learn more about in what capacity do you engage with M&E work in a day-to-day reality. So the second poll should be visible again on your screen shortly. Okay, so please welcome Hanadi Riyad, Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning Technical Specialist. Hanadi brings over 10 years of experience in the humanitarian and development sectors. She currently serves as Emerald Technical Specialist of an international consortium led by Plan International Jordan. During her career, Hanadi has managed large-scale impact evaluations, national surveys, and proof of concept studies, ensuring methodological rigor, ethical standards, and meaningful community participation. In her work, she is always exploring innovative methods and approaches to engage young people and communities in research in organic and transformative ways. Please also welcome Masumi Sarkar, who is the founder of the World Solutions, Masumi brings over 25 years of experience in qualitative and quantitative research at different levels. So having worked with for-profit companies, government agencies, NGOs, and political campaigns, Masumi has extensive experience working with stakeholders to develop and implement comprehensive research and evaluation methodologies. Most recently, she served as Senior Survey and Evaluation Methodology Advisor at USAID and as Assistant Survey Director at the US Census Bureau. In these roles, one of the key responsibilities was ensuring that research and evaluation activities were conducted ethically and centered on participants' physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Please also welcome our third but not last speaker, so Andrea Mrazova. Andrea is a Senior Research Associate and Vice Chair of Includovate Institutional Review Board. She holds a master's degree in law and is currently pursuing a PhD at Griffith University in Australia. She brings extensive experience navigating complex field-based research and ethical review processes. With a strong understanding of practical research challenges, she's particularly skilled at connecting real-world dilemmas to formal requirements, helping ensure ethical oversight is both rigorous and grounded in operational realities. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks to our attendees for their participation in our second poll. So if you haven't voted yet, please do so, because we will close the second poll shortly. Okay, so when asked our attendees in which capacity they engage with M&E work, we noticed that about 46% of our attendees today engage with M&E work as independent consultant or evaluator, another 30% as part of NGO, civil society practitioner. We have 15% representing private sector or work as a social impact professional, 7% working in academia or as a student, and then we have another one colleague or 2% who is representing the government or public sector staff. So thanks again, everyone, for participation in our polls. And I think we are ready to move to the actual presentations. Hanadi will go first. So Hanadi, I will give you the presenter rights. Okay, so I confirm we can see the presentation, but not in the full screen mode yet.
Not okay. It's still not in the full screen mode?
Not on my side.
Okay.
How about you, colleagues?
No, not yet.
Let me stop sharing and then start sharing again. Let's see. Let's see. How about now?
Yes, but we see the next slide, so it's still not entirely.
I see the notes. Okay. Let's try. Okay. Now?
I don't see it at all.
Still okay. That is interesting. Let me stop sharing again.
Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties. If this doesn't work, I have it on my screen, on my laptop. I can also share the screen if needed. So let's try one more time to see if it's working.
Okay. One more time.
Perfect. So I see it in full screen mode and it's working.
Okay, great.
Good luck.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I can't see my notes, but that's okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I'll then get right to it. So I'll be focusing mostly on ethical dilemmas where basically there are usually two right answers. So this is basically, it happens when, as was mentioned, two or more competing courses of actions, we need to select one of those. Each is supported by a legitimate ethical principle. And usually choosing one means compromising the other. This arises when there are power asymmetries, when there are institutional and operational constraints and pressures, when contexts are complex. And it is usually the case that contexts, of course, all contexts bring with them their own complexities and particulars. So in these situations, usually, I mean, by definition, an ethical dilemma is when there are two competing ethical principles, both are important. And so there's no obviously wrong answer. There are two right answers. Sometimes one is more right than the other, but usually the answer is very context specific. And it's really a reflection of our own worldviews and ethical frameworks, where we come from, basically. So we always need to be adaptable and conscious that our choices might, we might make a different choice for the same dilemma in a different context, and that's totally fine. Ethical dilemmas happen all across the evaluation cycle. It's not only in data collection, although it's probably most dominant or most prominent in data collection and most urgent. But it happens all across, from the designing phase to the sampling and recruitment phase to the translation phase, for those of us who work across contexts where translation is actually, a very important and sometimes even lengthy phase. Obviously, data collection and data management as well, analysis and interpretation, as well as in reporting and dissemination. In my presentation, I will be focusing less, I'll be actually skipping over data collection and data management, since those are covered by my colleagues. Starting with proposal development and design. So this is where basically we decide what we choose to know, what we choose to measure, what's the learning gap that we want to fill. And there are a lot of possible principles, ethical principles that can collide in this stage. I'll be focusing on standardization versus contextual relevance, rigor versus fairness. What does it look like? So usually we are asked to use internationally recognized concepts and indicators to ensure comparability of our results. But we also recognize that those concepts and indicators, although validated, they may not actually fully capture local understandings and experiences of the communities where we're working with. So one example that we are actually we have worked with extensively over the last few years is the concept of empowerment. I think empowerment as a concept is very much used in the West. It's actually a very hard term and concept to translate in Arabic. And it does mean something different to different communities. While in the West and in maybe more internationally recognized approaches and literature, it very much focuses on independence. In certain communities, it's very important to recognize that empowerment, part of it is actually the ability to rely on others, the ability to depend on others. So networks of social protection, that's something that's also part of empowerment, but unfortunately, it's not very much part of those validated indicators that we usually use. So recognizing that tension is very important. Also in design, I think, probably most of us are very much aware of the extensive literature on how experimental designs are, ethically sometimes challenging and problematic. Although rigorous, they're actually not very equitable. Of course, excluding certain groups of people from receiving implementation, from receiving a program, which they might be very much in need of, that's ethically problematic. But rigor is also very important. So recognizing these two important principles and how they can collide together in the field, this is very important. Again, no obviously wrong answer, but when we can address those things. Of course, reflecting and identifying trade-offs, that's very important. Once we make a decision, then we need to recognize that there is a trade-off that's taking place, and we need to be very explicit and deliberate about the documentation and the rationale, but also the implications of these trade-offs. Why we are choosing to measure certain concepts in certain ways. It's very important to be part of our documentation, but also just of our, of the overall ethical framework of the study that we're carrying out. It's obviously when resources allow, of course, the better course of action is to be inclusive of the most important local concepts that that would reflect actually the realities of the research participants as well. It's also very important to seek multiple perspectives, especially when designing and planning for the study. Involving participants in whatever capacity possible is very important, as well as local partners when deciding on design and identifying outcomes and measures. This could be really helpful. In the past, we've actually done some, workshops. We've convened some committees with participants from the community as well as local partners to discuss, certain design aspects, including measures and instruments. So I think this is really important. Although, of course, we do recognize that sometimes just resources might not allow that. But again, trade-offs happen, but we just need to be rigorous about documenting those. In sampling and recruitment, also a lot of dilemmas might come up. This is mainly about us deciding whose voices we are hearing, whose voices we are actually, are we're helping for others to hear. So mainly it's inclusion versus protection. That's a lot of the situations, a lot of the dilemmas that come into play in this phase are mainly about inclusion and protection, or the collision between inclusion and protection principles, but also about equity and feasibility. So how this looks like. So in many cases, the groups that we want to study are actually those groups who are most vulnerable. We are actually studying their situation because they are the groups that are most vulnerable. So, for instance, from my context here in Jordan, we do a lot of studies with Syrian refugees, but it becomes sometimes problematic when, for instance, given how, for instance, economically restricted they are, how restricted they are in the economic activities that they can engage in Jordan. It's challenging then to interview them, especially in focus group format, to ask about those activities that they engage in the informal economy. So, for us to be able to understand the protection risks that they are encountering in the informal economy, we need to sit with them and ask them about those activities. But that carries with it a lot of protection risk. So having to choose between, interviewing them and studying their situation, and not, given the protection risks, that's not an easy choice. And again, it might involve certain trade-offs. Also, another dilemma. We work with a lot of programs work with very broad groups of people, and when it's time for evaluation, most programs want to evaluate the impact that they've had on all of these groups of people. Sometimes that's very challenging because of constraints, time-wise, resource-wise, but also accessibility and sometimes even security. Again, Syrian refugees, that's another example, or a relevant example here as well. But we can mitigate these dilemmas by conducting risk assessments for including, for the implications of including these different participant groups in our evaluations. And, it's usually we learn a lot when we are actually involving these participants in those risk assessments. So that's really, I've found it very helpful. It's also it's just good practice to be very self-reflective and deliberate about who is being excluded from the sample. When we make a decision, for us to know who's being excluded and why, and how this is actually shaping whose voices are heard. Again, trade-offs, but being transparent about these trade-offs are really important, because those translate sometimes into limitations, and that's fine. But it's also very important also to just plan for costs, for access costs mainly, beforehand. Accessing certain groups of people, it does incur costs, and just being deliberate about the planning of accessing those groups of people, this is very, very important. So just pre-planning is just good practice overall. When it comes to translation and interpretation, and of course, translation and interpretation it's usually not not a phase that ends. It's a process. It's actually cross-cutting of most of these phases. But just for the sake of this presentation, treating it as a standalone phase, it's mainly about the meaning that we're hearing. It's not only about the voice, but also the accuracy of that voice and the meaning that that voice carries. So we have competing principles here between accuracy and cultural relevance, between consistency and contextual adaptation, between also participant voices, the most obvious, and interpretive mediation. So translating questions and consent materials literally to preserve meaning, I think to preserve meaning and the validity of certain tools. That's I think we're all hyper aware of the importance of that, especially when it comes to consent forms. But also, it's healthy to recognize that this is not, this is not controversial. It might be problematic, especially when the language, when the translation, or we're translating from a legal language. I know that recently we've been translating a couple of consent forms to be used in the field. The very legal language is not easy for many to understand, but also for participants, it's even harder to understand. So I think we just need to be aware of the groups with whom we're working, the participants, and what kind of language adaptations we need to do before going to the field. That's very important. And also making sure that enumerators are also aware of these, of these challenges and dilemmas. We also use standardized translations across contexts, but this is also sometimes problematic because we need to recognize that concepts may have different meanings across different communities, even within the same country. I know that a few years ago we had a study where there was a lot of focus on, it was a qualitative study, but there was a lot of focus on traditional marriage and arranged marriage. And I know that it was very interesting that inside of Jordan, when asking about traditional marriage and arranged marriage, it had very different meaning in certain communities compared to other communities. Sometimes even within the Syrian community, because we work a lot with Syrian refugees, and sometimes across, it's different from how Syrian communities understand it in Jordan vis-a-vis Jordanian communities understand it in Jordan. So, recognizing that standardized translations might be, important sometimes, but concepts are different, and people mean by those concepts different things. So being aware of that is really healthy and important. I think one dilemma arises when working with interpreters, especially in live format. So we need to recognize that interpreters, of course, are very important to facilitate communications across languages, but also it's not only across languages, but also across cultures. So this means that interpretation inevitably involves judgment on how to translate certain concepts, as I was mentioning before, there are a lot of examples of, again, concepts that mean different things in different cultures, but also different languages. So it's very important to make sure that we are engaging translators not only in their capacities as translators, but also as partners in the research process. I know that I found it really helpful to work with translators and interpreters who've had certain research experiences. This has been really helpful to me. So again, I've already mentioned some of the mitigation measures, but I'll also add that it's very important to invest time in testing translations and key concepts before data collection. I mean, one way I think to do this, it's used by many people, cognitive interviews. I think cognitive interviews are actually really, really interesting, and they've been really helpful to me in the past. And again, just documenting and reflecting on important translation choices and where those might be a little bit problematic, because I know that in my career I've worked with many measures that were translated to Arabic, and sometimes there's just the concept simply does not translate accurately. I can think of the example of gender. Gender is just not, it does not translate into Arabic. So sometimes we even just say in Arabic, gender. So just being aware of those, of those possibly missed in translation concepts are really, is really important. And just, again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, maybe also focusing on the concepts that have relevance in the communities where we're working. So skipping over data collection and management and going to reporting and dissemination. So this is basically where we've come up with our results and with the we finished data collection, and this is where we decide what findings we share and how we share them. Competing principles here can be transparency versus do no harm, accountability and protection, and participant voices and privacy. So reporting findings transparently is obviously very important, but we also need to consider potential consequences for participants and communities. In the past, I've worked with participants in communities where there are a lot of stereotypes about these communities, and in my in my interviews with participants, a lot of these really harmful stereotypes were affirmed. So it was actually a dilemma, of to what extent do I share some of these findings and some of the data that we collected, because again, bearing in mind that affirming certain stereotypes will be harmful to the larger community. Also, sharing participant stories and quotations is usually very powerful, especially in reports that go to donors, etc., and also to the public. So this is a fairly common practice, but we also always need to be aware that protecting anonymity and confidentiality is very important as well. I've come across quite a few cases where, although participants themselves have given the consent for us to share their stories, that was actually in an MSc exercise, in a most significant change exercise. So if you don't know much about most significant change, I definitely encourage you to read up on it. It's a very interesting approach. Basically, these participants have given us the consent to share their stories, the particulars about these stories, as well as their identifying information. But it was a dilemma of, they're autonomous people. They can, of course, and should make their own decisions. But we think that if we publish these stories with the information, with the identifying personal information of participants, that could pose some harm to them. So these dilemmas can definitely happen because some stories are just sensitive. The most powerful stories tend to be, tend to share sometimes sensitive information about people and about communities and about their experiences. So that's one dilemma that come up in this phase. Disclosing negative or sensitive findings is usually also a matter of sometimes ethical consideration. Although obviously transparency is very important, but we also don't want to cause harm to the relationships between people, as I was mentioning, but also the reputations of and safety sometimes of certain staff or of certain organizations. So some mitigating measures here is to definitely assess potential risks beforehand and benefits before disseminating sensitive findings, of course. So we need to be very aware of the implications of sharing, stories and data, etc. And if in doubt, always involve stakeholders and consult safeguarding policies as appropriate. But I find that just consulting with the people who we might be most worried about is also very important. So if we have a concern about a certain story being published, so we just go back to the storyteller and say, well, do you want to consider this and this and that risk? What do you think? So maybe just sharing our concerns as well with the relevant stakeholders is very important. Protecting identities through anonymization, of course, that's just I think very important and standard, but also substitution. Sometimes when stories can be connected to certain people, even though we don't share their data. Sometimes we just substitute the real data with, fake data, basically. So, instead of this name, we put that name. Instead of this location, we put that location, and so on. Because, people in close-knitted communities, they can very easily identify each other. So maybe just taking, one step further than anonymization and go to substitution. That's also been helpful, I think, in my experience. Always, especially when it comes to negative or sensitive findings, always validate results with the relevant stakeholders, but also just give them the opportunity to explain those sensitive findings and maybe turn them into learning opportunities. I've had to share some sometimes unfortunate results of evaluations and studies, but it's really on the organization, on the program, to make out of this a learning opportunity. So we give them the opportunity, they can take advantage of it. And then that would also be part of the, of the findings that we do share. So it's not entirely negative, but it's also constructive. So this is also has been helpful to me.
Hanadi, just a quick
Yes.
reminder, we are running out of time, so
I'm almost done.
okay, thank you.
Yes. So ending with, of course, all of us ask about the rigor of the design, about the representativeness of the sample, about the credibility of the findings. But we also need to ask, who is defining success? Who is defining if a program is successful or not, how we're actually involving participants, who is excluded from our sample and from the voices that we are magnifying, and who's included, who is bearing the burden in these evaluations, and who is controlling the meaning, and who is benefiting from disclosure. So with this, I would like to maybe just share two practices that have also just all across that I've found very, very helpful to me in the past. Proof of concept studies. In many cases, proof of concept studies are conducted to test the concept of a certain program. But I've also found them to be very helpful to test the concept of the study itself, of the evaluation itself. So it's a very good, test run of our design, of our sampling, of our research processes overall. So this is one thing I definitely try to do whenever possible. Although, again, I'm aware of the kind of resources it might require, but, again, even small, very small scale studies, proof of concept studies could be very helpful. Another cross-cutting practice is communities of practice. I've had to work in contexts where I don't know really much about certain particulars in that concept and in that context. And so what I would do is just, search online on LinkedIn sometimes for researchers who are working on that context, who've had certain, long experiences in that context. Again, if you go to their LinkedIn pages, you would know that about them. And just, email them and ask for their advice. In many cases, I would say you might not get a response, but getting any response is really is a win to me. So I've had successes in the past with that approach as well, just consulting local researchers who've had extensive experience in navigating some of these dilemmas in their own context. So with that, I end. Thank you very, very much. Back to you, Owen.
Thank you so much, Hanadi. Okay, so I think we can move to Andrea. Andrea, I'll give you the presenter rights. Okay, I confirm I can see your screen.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you, Hanadi, for excellent presentation. I would like to not reiterate what Hanadi mentioned regarding the definition, but I just want to emphasize that, as Hanadi outlined, the ethical dilemmas can happen in all stages of research. And in many situations, researchers know what ethical principles should guide their work, but the challenge arises when following one principle may require compromising another. And these are particularly common in contexts of political sensitivities and when working with vulnerable populations. So it's important to know that ethical dilemmas do not always have perfect solutions. Instead, they require thoughtful judgment, reflection, and accountability. And in Includovate, we have Institutional Review Board, which is an ethics committee. It reviews research according to ethical standards, and its purpose is to protect the rights and welfare of research participants. What is different is that it is not only an oversight body, but in Includovate, it works as a collaborative partner, supporting researchers in designing and implementing ethically sound and inclusive studies. It includes leadership from low to middle-income countries, and this ensures that the research oversight reflects local priorities and the cultural contexts, and most importantly, the perspectives of the communities which are most affected by these studies. And this reflects also in Includovate IRB's membership. So we have people based in various countries. They represent a range of genders, religions, ages, and disciplines. We have, for example, health workers, lawyers, NGO leaders, disability activists, and researchers. And all of this is designed not only to uphold high ethical standards, but to support innovative and inclusive research, which is based on community-based approaches. We also support innovative methodologies, indigenous and participatory methodologies. And this diverse representative membership helps to ensure that the ethics review processes are reflecting the different cultural contexts, the knowledge systems, and the lived experiences of the communities. So as Hannah mentioned, there are various ethical principles that can come into conflict. Just some are the respect, the autonomy of the participants, the privacy, beneficence, do no harm principle, and non-discrimination. And now I would like to outline 4 examples of conflicts that arise from our practice. And our first example concerns informed consent versus cultural norms. So imagine a researcher who is conducting interviews with women about reproductive health. And then community leaders require that husbands must first approve the women's participation. And this creates a clear ethical tension. So on one hand, the researchers should respect the local customs and the social structures. But on the other hand, international research ethics standards require that participation needs to be voluntary and based on individuals' own informed consent. So the key question here is, how do we respect cultural norms without compromising participants' autonomy? And some possible approaches include building trust first and building relationships with the community leaders even before the data collection begins, explaining them the purpose and importance of individual informed consent, and also using culturally appropriate communication methods. So it can be, for example, oral consent for women without literacy. And very important, to ensure that these women can make participation decisions privately and safely. And the goal here is not to impose external values, but to uphold ethical standards while engaging respectfully within these local contexts. And my second example addresses a dilemma that many researchers find emotionally challenging. And this is helping participants versus maintaining neutrality. So imagine that you are visiting a participant's home and observing severe poverty. There can be little food available, the family members appear to be struggling, So as human beings, our instinct may be to help immediately. However, providing assistance to one participant may create unintended consequences. So it could influence participant responses. They may feel compelled to respond in a certain way, and it can also create expectations among others. So the whole community may then come to you and request some kind of compensation. And it can also affect the validity and neutrality of the research. So we need to be very careful not to create a conflict here. And some good practices how to respond to this is to clearly explain what is your role from the outset. So you need to avoid promises or assistance that cannot be fulfilled. And at the same time, you can carry information about some local services, some NGOs, it can be healthcare providers or protection mechanisms that may actually offer the support. Researchers should be empathetic and respectful, but they must also avoid actions that could compromise the research or to create false expectations. Our third example concerns some incentives versus coercion. So imagine you are conducting a survey in a refugee camp where participants are offered monetary compensation for participation. While the compensation can be beneficial, it can acknowledge participants' time, their effort, but be very careful because it can also influence decision making. So for someone who is facing significant hardship, this money can feel impossible to refuse. And this raises an important ethical concern. Is the participation truly voluntary? If the people are feeling compelled by the reward to participate in this research. So to address this risk, is this recommended to use either modest or proportionate compensation wherever it's possible, and to consider non-monetary forms of appreciation. This can be, for example, refreshments. It's also recommended to clearly explain that the compensation is not dependent on specific answers. And this is very important in regard to the right to withdraw part-time from the study. And participants need to know that they can withdraw from the study anytime without any penalty. The objective here is to recognize participants' contributions, but also to protect the voluntary informed consent. And another example of an ethical dilemma that we encountered addresses the confidentiality versus reporting and participant safety. So imagine that you are interviewing some women as part of a research study, and during this interview, one participant discloses that there is ongoing violence from her husband. So what to do in these sensitive cases? Researchers have promised confidentiality, but at the same time, they may feel a responsibility to support someone who is experiencing harm. How to address it also depends on the very circumstances of the case, and also whether the participant is a child or it's an adult. So it's very important to listen respectfully, avoid making promises, but at the same time, have the referral pathways prepared already before the fieldwork starts. So you should have prepared some information about local organizations. It can be protection services, healthcare providers, or counselors. And if the participant chooses to report abuse, offer guidance on how to do it and support them to do so. The preparation here is critical, and researchers should anticipate such disclosure, especially if the project or the research is concerning these kind of sensitive topics. So what should researchers do when ethical dilemmas arise unexpectedly in the field? So it's important to know that encountering these dilemmas often reflects the complexity of real-world research, and these happen very often. So what matters most is how to respond. If it is safe and feasible, take a moment to assess the situation, pause, and do not do any immediate action. It's not always necessary, and the thoughtful reflection can prevent some unintended harm. It's also important to document what happened, when it occurred, who was involved, and focus on factual observations rather than assumptions. You can ask yourself what ethical principles are actually in tension. So as I mentioned before, it can be the autonomy, do no harm principle, transparency, beneficence. So could harm result from your action or inaction, and what options are available? And it is very much recommended to reach out. If you are unsure, seek guidance. Very often projects have some safeguarding focus point who can be contacted immediately in case of safeguarding issues. You can also contact your supervisor, ethics focal point, or your ethical review board. And very important that after this situation is resolved, reflect on some lessons learned, because to debrief and learn from it is very important. So consider whether the protocols that you have in place should be changed, or additional training is needed, or any other safeguards that need to be done for strengthening your future work. Because every ethical challenge presents an opportunity for improvement. So thank you so much. I would just like to conclude that the ethical dilemmas are a normal part of research, and there may not always be a perfect solution. It always needs some balancing of competing responsibilities, but the preparation matters. So it's important to anticipate the risks and develop some protocols in advance, discuss the potential dilemmas before the fieldwork begins. And finally, ethical research is not just about the compliance, but it is about protecting the rights and safety of the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Dear colleagues, so we'll move to the third presentation, Masumi. So I assume Masumi will need about 50 minutes to cover her part. And then after that, we move to the Q&A session. I noticed already that we have a number of questions that we received, but please send your questions and we'll be sure to cover majority of those during the Q&A session, which will follow after. So, Masumi, I will give you the presenter rights right now. Okay.
Can you all see it?
Yeah, so I confirm we can see it in full screen.
Before I get through mine really quickly, so because we are running short on time. So with that, I'm started. First, let's talk about what doing studies in LMICs often, what the reality on the ground is. We know from anecdotal evidence that researchers and evaluators working have ethical dilemmas that are not covered in initial protocol. This often happens because the reviews happen in rich donor countries where IRBs are not aware of ground level realities. For example, here in the States, you have a nice focus group facility, everything, it's easy to maintain confidentiality, but sometimes when you're out in, in somewhere in a village in Asia or Africa, you're doing your focus group under a tree where the entire community might come out to watch what's going on and listen in. So how do you then think about confidentiality and privacy under those circumstances? So some of the common constraints are, of course, as we've already discussed, poverty. People are incentivized to participate if they think they will get something out of it. Low literacy levels can be real barrier to obtaining informed consent. Sometimes people are not capable of understanding what a study is. So how do you explain that to them? Power imbalances, there are gatekeepers often who will prevent data collection. There are security risks. We've had militants come and tell us to leave the village. That means even if the respondent has given consent, we cannot collect that data, which would then ultimately bias your data set. There is political repression where certain questions cannot be asked, or if they are asked, the data security becomes a real issue. Hierarchical community and family structures where, control access to respondents might be controlled by family members, and what they can or cannot say are controlled by these hierarchical structures. There are a lack of mental health or other support. For example, here in the US, when we do surveys that might be triggering or cause emotional, may have emotional repercussions, we have a plan in place and a hotline to hand people off to for counseling. These types of services are often not available, and we don't really think of these types of things when it comes to doing surveys and LMICs. We don't always think about the PTSD or trauma many of our respondents may have experienced, and obviously inadequate infrastructure data and ensuring confidentiality, which can also cause harms if that data gets leaked or accessed by people who should not have access to it. And of course, there are cultural contexts, as some the other two presenters have already discussed, where people where concepts of informed consent might vary even within countries and regions about how people think about that. So with that, I just want to note that standard ethics assume time, literacy, legal recourse, and individual autonomy. But in LMIC settings, these are often absent. So what we need is to be adaptable and use situational ethics, do the right thing based on what situation comes at you. So let's go over some quick scenarios here. The first one, what is informed in informed consent? Let's take a look at this picture. It's a woman who has very little formal education, is providing verbal consent while her husband stands listening to her and the enumerator. So what's the issue here? Is this truly voluntary? Is she giving this consent purely because or not because of what her own what she wants to do, or is it because her husband's standing there expecting her to give a certain response? If she does not understand what a research study is or an evaluation means, can she really provide informed consent? And in those cases, what do we do? What type of consent do we use? Is it long with details, which especially in an oral rendering can get lost? Or is it short with just the necessary information, but might not include all the information that is necessary? So what are some things we can do? We can train enumerators to ask for privacy. Use a continuous consent process that is not a one-time signature, but it continuously explains the consent protocols through, especially when you get to sensitive questions, and ensures that the respondent understands that they have the option not to answer, and it is only and it's up to them, right? And to explain it in as much of the local colloquial language as possible. If possible, budget for translators who are trained in ethics protocol, or train your translators into ethics protocols so that they can then in the local language explain the consent to respondents, in the detail that is required. The compensation conundrum, we've already talked about this a little bit. You're offering $5 to cover transportation, and you need 10 interviews, but 50 people show up. What do you do? Is the payment, are you coercing participation? The cash payments might put respondents at risk from those you did not select for theft and other types of violence. So here, one of the things to think about is to shift from cash to other appropriate tokens such as soap, food, mobile credits. We've also given out, like especially to youth, paper, pencils, that kind of thing. Rule of thumb is the incentive should not exceed 1 to 2 hours of local and unskilled wage. And be transparent about it. Let people know that those who participate will get X, they would not lose any future services, but they will not receive a job or other benefits, because we often get those questions, like they think, because they are participating in this interview that we couldn't give them a job or give them admission into a school or, things like that. And it's very clear, important to set clear expectations. There's the gatekeeper problem where, for example, a village chief might demand a fee before allowing enumerators into the village to collect data. The paying these fees might look like bribery, and it might make certain households not respond to the survey, which would skew our data, but also refusing would eliminate the entire village from data collection effort, thus severely biasing your data. So what do you do? One option is to work with the village chief to offer a benefit that would be a benefit for the whole community, like a shared meal or a goat that the village can share, supplies for the village school, and or a feedback session of findings. And also escalate internally, obtain permission from senior research managers before you offer anything that you're offering. It is best to address these situations in your protocol, to be aware that these situations can arise and have a plan ahead of time. Data security in challenging contexts, we talked about that a little bit. Say you're collecting STD data asking about sexual partners and practices. These data, if compromised, could be used by the community or the government in certain places to target vulnerable groups. And say we are in a place where the government monitors data transmissions and can demand access to servers. So, digital data is risky because there is no secure transmission and it can be confiscated. Same with your paper data. It could be stolen, confiscated. So how do you protect your respondents? Is to think about minimizing your data collection. I mean, ask a lot of questions that often we don't need, or a level of detail sometimes we do not need. Like, do we really need a date of birth, or is just asking for an age or an age range sufficient for our analytical purposes? Because asking a date of birth is personal information, that identifying information that can compromise a respondent. So think about that in your survey designs or questionnaire designs, like what level of detail do you actually need? Split identifiers, keep all PII separate from responses, like maybe keep the demographic section of the data that you're collecting in a separate file, in a separate server, or a separate form to all the other data you're collecting so that they cannot be easily merged or matched. And also have an emergency destruction plan. What if somebody comes and demands that data from you, and releasing the would compromise respondents? Have a plan in place to destroy the data if necessary. Train enumerators to do so, and have protocols in place that they can follow in those cases. One of the things we sometimes do is do harm by doing good. Say you're evaluating a peace building program and surveying household in the program's target area, and you're asking very sensitive questions about their experiences in, say, a recent war, about the physical, emotional, or sexual violence that they might have experienced. Now, if we things in the US, we would definitely have a hotline ready and waiting. But this does not happen in LMICs. Researchers often do not think to incorporate those elements. For example, when we measure malnutrition among children, we had in USA in place that if we found malnourished children, then we would immediately trigger a response to make sure the child got treatment. And we would have organizations standing by to be able to respond. Similarly, we need to have mental health experts standing by when we ask these very sensitive questions. So some of the solutions are pre-define an intervention clause. Define in your study protocol what would be evidence of such trauma, or at what point do you trigger? Like with malnutrition, there's a set number which triggered a response. If this number showed up, then immediately you needed to take. Similarly, for all your studies, you should have those types of, what would trigger an intervention, and what would that intervention be? Have personnel, necessary organizations or personnel available to be able to respond. Budget for it. We often do not budget for these. Document and report upward without blaming the respondent. And the other thing that happens, and this goes back to scenario 4 also, the thick anonymization of data. Change non-essential details. Like at the Census Bureau, we'd often change age by a couple of years, just to make sure that the respondent could not be identified in any way, shape, or form. Combine categories. You do not need to release everything. Make sure, like say education, maybe you can combine into larger categories while still keeping the analytical relevance. And be mindful of details in public reports. Maybe the public report has, like internal reports can have more details, whereas public reports can be more general. Make sure that there is no way respondents can be identified. So with that, what do we need to do? What kind of systems do we need to build so that we can make sure people are collecting data in ethical ways and not harming people? I mean, one of the things is to, like in the pre-field time, really think through what kind of issues you might come across in the field. What are the scenarios? Use an advisory group of local community members who are familiar with the local context and can address to the issues you may encounter. During the field, have a daily checklist of ethical issues that you have encountered. Empower enumerators to call off data collection if they sense imminent harm. And this is, again, something we don't do in the post-field, like we debrief about our data collection efforts, but we don't talk about the ethical near misses that might have happened, if there were ethical issues that we had to address that were not addressed in the protocol. Have a session talking about it, learn from it. And finally, make sure you budget some money to do this, because nothing is free. Often don't budget for ethics. Maybe we budget for the IRB review, but we don't budget for beyond that. So think about emergencies that might come up in the unanticipated, that might happen in the field that you might need. For example, finding a malnourished child when you were not expecting that, and to have them able to do an intervention if necessary. And so, I just want to say, remember, we do not have the ability to know what will make things better or worse. These are, for the most part, not our lived experiences. We almost never know better, but we can bring resources and expertise to help communities achieve their goals. And the key is to work with local researchers and evaluators to ensure that local needs are being addressed in such study protocols. So the big takeaway is co-create whenever possible and localize, localize, localize. And just a little checklist. I could have given it to you as a handout, but these are some of the things to think about. Who is not in the room? What is the worst case harm if the data leak? What can we offer right now and not like later down the road? and have an emergency contact for ethical consultation, especially for your people out in the field, and consult with this person if they come across unanticipated issues. In summary, ethical field research is not about perfectly following a checklist that was approved thousands of miles away. It is about being adaptable, of reflexive adaptation, where that is making the least worst choice as transparently as you can, and correcting course as swiftly as you can. With that, I will take questions, comments, or any thoughts you might have. And here's my contact information, so feel free to reach out to me directly if you would like to discuss any of these issues in more detail. Thanks. And with that, I'll end the slideshow.
Thank you so much, Masumi. Thanks so much to all of our speakers today. So, and also thanks so much for the entities who stayed with us until this point. So I think we can move now to the Q&A session. So we have a number of questions that arrived. So I'll start the first one, question which came from Mahaman. So Mahaman asks, how do you navigate the ethical dilemma when a major donor or host government pressures the evaluation team to soften negative findings regarding infrastructure or government projects, especially when future funding or local projects acceptance depends on it? So,
I mean, as I'm on camera, I guess I can answer that.
Please.
To us many times with Feed the Future reports, when we would release poverty numbers that the government did not like, they would want us to suppress the report. And so then, you know, we spent months sometime working with the government to try figure out a that would work and that would not compromise the actual true findings. And, you know, sometimes it's a matter of making sure they are not held liable, that, oh, poverty numbers went up, but, you know, it's the macroeconomic factors, blah, blah, blah. So you can say that, you know, whatever, sometimes you just have to spin it a little differently, but still make sure that the actual data are being reported. So it's a matter of striking compromises and having those discussions with your stakeholders, and you know, again, localize, bring people into the room.
Thank you, Masumi. Hanadi and Andrea, would you like to join also? Anything to add from your side?
So I don't think I heard the whole question, but I think I understood the spirit of it. I think working with stakeholders from the very beginning, especially, you know, when stakeholders are vital decision makers as to what gets published eventually or not, I think working with them from the very beginning is really important. Documenting certain agreements is also very important. I know that I've worked with some, you know, government entities about very sensitive / political issues in some countries where, yes, at the very end, certain results were asked to be excluded from a report. But then, you know, we went back to the protocol, the agreements, you know, the initial understandings, and that worked out. Also, sometimes, again, really depending on the actual results and the sensitivities of it. Yes, I agree, making compromises might be essential and acceptable. Sometimes we acknowledge in the published report that certain findings were excluded, obviously spinning the reason for a while, you know, trying to be transparent, but also, you know, making sure that we're not, again, you know, doing harm. But, you know, something that we also do when we do not publish or exclude certain findings is we write a standalone report on those negative findings and make sure that it's known that this report was shared with the stakeholders who should take action based on that report.
Thank you. Hanadi. Andrea, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I totally agree. I think that it's important that the research conclusions should be driven by evidence rather than political or some ideological pressures. So it's important to maintain the public trust, and it depends on preserving the independence of the research process. And something that proved very supportive in the past is, for example, to seek support from other entities. It can be, for example, UN support or even support from the IRB, and it takes the pressure off from only one person if you have a support from your other stakeholders.
Okay, thanks so much, Andrea. So we're moving to the next question from Ventura, and this question refers to the issue of translation, as Hanadi was comprehensively covering. So Ventura is asking, for example, taking the empowerment word or the lack of globally standard definition, would you advise to use locally context-specific concepts which act as synonym, or how would you advise to approach this issue?
Yes, I think I think being transparent about this, this lack of accurate translation and that challenge in translation, I think that's very important. So being just transparent with the donor, with the whoever commissioned you to do the evaluation, that's very important. But also definitely, I would advocate for, whenever possible, to use and capitalize on local concepts, local systems of knowledge generation. It might not be easy, but I would say, as my colleagues also mentioned, partnering with local researchers can be very, very useful and really important. Yes, so I would definitely advocate for using local concepts, and of course, whenever possible, trying to use the concepts that are most relevant to that other concept that really doesn't translate fully. So we're not on totally different pages, but we're on similar pages, if not the same page.
Thank you. Anything
If
from
I can add,
yeah, please.
Yes, I think that also important is to pre-trial, for example, the tools. And if you do a pre-trial before the data collection starts, you can capture all of these translation things that you may not anticipate in before, and then once you have feedback from the community, then you can adjust the tools.
Thank you, Andrea. Masumi?
Yeah, I just wanted to note, like, Hanadi in passing mentioned cognitive interviews. I do these all the time to test translations, and I will not go into the field without doing that, because you do find differences in key concepts that we just take for granted that people will understand. And people interpret these differently cross-culturally. For example, something like human rights. I mean, we even stopped asking the question, like, because it was just interpreted in so many different ways across different cultures, that there was really actually to come up with something that was a word that we could use. So we ended up going with other questions to get to that concept. Very simply, like, for example, we always ask a question in employment: do you work a temporary or permanent job? And in a lot of the translate cultural context, we were getting the wrong response, because people's response was, well, I'm just doing this for now. I'm not going to do this for the rest of my life. So it's very important to, do some cognitive testing to actually understand getting equivalency in your measures, because you may have to ask the question differently in that context. But the key is to make sure it's still equivalent. across, and it can be compared or combined, right? And you cannot do that unless you establish that equivalency, that validity. And it's very important to do cognitive interviews, I think, in order to establish that.
Thank you so much. So we'll cover 2 more questions and then we'll close for today's session. So the next question actually is connected to the previous one. So Abir asks about the usage of AI assisted translation for the monitoring and evaluation. So it's from Abir's point of view, this actually really ruins the actual results. So what is your opinion on that? Should organization use AI or still lean towards human translation or interpreter? Sorry.
Well, we do use AI for the first draft because AI is getting better on some languages, like it does Spanish very well, but not all, many languages it does not. But then we still continue to use the committee approach where you have at least 3 people who will review that and then iterate on that and together come to a translation that that would work. And you want translators from the local community whenever possible. But so AI is a tool that can create some efficiencies, like maybe get your first draft in and then you can iterate on that, but it cannot be the final product. At least it's not good enough to be right now.
Okay.
In Includovate, we are just working on the guidelines on the use of AI for our IRB. So this is very important question and very timely. While AI can offer some efficiencies, we need to be very careful about the possible bias. There is lack of transparency also, so very important that the researchers would mention which kind of tool they are using, how they are using it, and double check the results because it can produce some very bad results.
So I definitely agree with Andrea. I think privacy, the lack of transparency around privacy and AI, I think that's a little bit concerning to many of us in the sector. I personally really use AI, for translation or otherwise, depending on the context and the actual, document / data and information that I'm seeking to translate. For now, I personally don't actually use it for translation. Of course, of transcripts, because in transcripts there are a lot of, even when the actual transcript is de-identified, sometimes inside of the transcript there are a lot of identifying information about the person or other people, etc. So for now, I don't actually use it. Although I would say, if you do decide to use it, I would definitely include that in the consent. I think participants, should be able to say, do you get to feed whatever they're telling you into an AI system or not?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think a question / comment from Toby. So Toby is mentioning that the ethical consideration is varies significantly between academia and development work. Have you noticed this? And if so, are there any ways to kind of mitigate the differences when both sectors are involved in the research?
Well, I don't see, at USAID, we worked with a lot of academic institutions and a lot of our research or evaluations were done by academic researchers. So, and the goal is to be as possible and to use the ethical standards set by the academics mostly, so I don't really see that as like an either or like there's a big difference between what we are doing versus what academics are doing, because we are working often with academics to do this work.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe if the question was more about how to make it possible with the practice more, so I would say that it's important for the academic, if the IRB is based in an academic institution, to seek feedback on how the research actually went after the ethical approval. So monitoring of any adverse events. Was there any kind of incident regarding safeguarding, etc.? So that even if the IRB is based in academia, they have feedback on real world challenges and they can reflect in the future applications.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with the general sentiment that I personally don't see a whole lot of difference between the challenges or dilemmas faced by evaluators in the sector and in academia. I think, I mean, the main difference to my mind is the pace at which we in the field are having to deal with these dilemmas, especially, you know, in implementation research, we are more aware, I think, and conscious of the need for adaptability and just, you know, act very fast and make decisions on these dilemmas that come up all the time, really.
Thank you. And I think the last question, before I actually address the last question, just a quick reminder for the remaining attendees. Please note that we have the third poll running. So if you'd like to learn more about DevelopmentAid tools for individual consultants or for organizations, please leave your option or your vote, cast your vote. So the last question is from Yakim. And Akim is asking if there is a place or process where members of the M&E community can share lesson learned and materials to improve the response to the to this kind of dilemmas if they appear in the future.
I'm not aware about the monitoring and evaluation platform, but you can definitely send us an email in our IRB and we can advise you in that regard.
And I also consider this this event that we have today is also a space to share experiences and and advices on how to approach these dilemmas in the future. So if you want to receive the presentations, feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'll be happy to share them. Nadia, please.
So there are actually a few platforms / websites where you know, sort of small or not very small communities of practice have been you know, active. I can share some of those if you'd like, but I think, again, you know, I've shared a practice where I've just emailed basically random people in certain contexts where you know, I wasn't sure about how to navigate certain dilemmas. I think that's also you know, a very good approach, especially, and very targeted approach, you know, to these people who work in a certain context. But yeah, I agree. I mean, also, you know, the presentations on this panel, I think it's been very useful.
I just want to echo the same thing. You can reach out to groups of, you know, there are practitioner groups out there, there are academic groups out there, there are, professional associations where we, like the American Association of Public Opinion Research or the World Association of Public Opinion Research, where these are often, and you can always go to association, those listservs and association members for advice. And, you know, my information's out there, so feel free to reach out.
Yes, indeed. So feel free to reach out to any of our speakers today and to us directly. Also, I noticed that Joanne is asking for the presentation. Please reach out to me directly and I'll be happy to share. So before we wrap up, I would like to thank Hanadi, Masumi, and Andrea for sharing their perspectives on how to identify common ethical dilemmas and how to apply practical strategies to overcome them. I thank everyone who found the time to join us today. It was a longer session than usual, so I thank you for your patience, for interest. So I wish you a nice day ahead, and we look forward to welcome you again to our next session on next Thursday, which will be an Ask Me Anything session. We look forward to welcome you then. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.